So for our next panel, Andrew is going to co-moderate, and he's going to co-moderate with a great friend and another alum of Villanova Law School, Jami McKeon, who graduated with me a long time ago. And I couldn't be prouder of her and her career. Jami is now the chair of Morgan Lewis here in Philadelphia and around the world, of course. And we're very proud to have her back as part of our symposium today. So with no further ado, Jami McKeon, Andrew Brandt, look forward to our next panel.
Thanks, Jeff, and glad to co-host here with Jami, who was quite a distinguished Villanova Law alum. Glad to have her up here with me. So we'll bring up the panel. Guys, come on up. As you know, I wear different hats, and some of those hats are media, and this is kind of the perfect panel so I can bring in people that I work with on the media side as well, and I'll do that. I'm going to introduce these guys very quickly, but let them talk, because I know you want to hear from all of these guys. On the far left is Jane McManus, espnW. I work with her at ESPN. Always someone that I admire, learn from whenever I listen to her, and I'm just proud to have her as a colleague. Next to her is Jack Ford. You all know Jack Ford, 60 Minutes Sports. Jack, I remember covering the OJ trial. I'd love to hear some stories there. What a voice he was about the OJ trial so many years ago, and you see him all over. You've seen him on NBC, CBS, everywhere. This guy's name is Chuck Todd, Meet the Press, political director at NBC News. As I said, we were worried. Who would worry about a sports symposium being affected by Syria airstrikes? We were worried. He's here. He chose us over Syria. Who wouldn't? And Peter King, as many of you know, I write for something called the MMQB, run and started and founded by one Peter King, the lead NFL writer in my mind in the entire world. It's not pressure there, Peter. And Peter's gracious enough to be with us here this morning as well. So let's welcome this panel. And I'll start with you, Peter. What I'd like each of you guys to do is sort of say, your role in media as we look at the changing landscape, sports media, and this millennial world we're in, shorter attention spans, live streaming, digital, all the above, how your role has changed, and I know you've gone through a lot of transformations in your long career. Talk about that. We'll go down the line. Listen to each of you guys.
Well, Andrew, first of all, thanks a lot for having me here. This is an utterly beautiful place, and I really appreciate the invitation. I would just say two things at the start of this. Number one is, so when I founded the MMQB in 2013, Sports Illustrated and Time Inc. were gracious enough and nice enough to basically say, do what you want to do. And so my thought was, and I had an awful lot of writer friends of mine who wanted jobs at this site. And so this is going to be our 5th year covering the NFL in sort of a unique way. And so what I have done, what I really wanted to do, is I wanted to hire people who were different than I am. And of the 6 other full-time writers and 6 other full-time people we have at our staff writing, doing video, doing social for us, the average age is 28 years, 9 months. And the reason that I wanted to do that is that I am a dinosaur. I turned 60 in June, and I'm not going to be around much longer. Who knows how much longer I'll be around? I don't mean
easy,
on the
Peter,
planet.
Easy.
I just mean running things. But
you just broke some news here.
What I really wanted to do was I wanted to try to help empower the next generation of people who are going to be doing this job. And also, I wanted new ideas. I didn't want to cover the NFL the exact same way that we had covered it for a long time. I wanted people to say, for instance, hey, explain Snapchat to me, explain Periscope, explain all these things and how people are consuming media. Our jobs as journalists, as people covering professional football, our jobs are changing dramatically, but in essence, they haven't changed at all. I am trying to bring you stories, and I'm trying to tell you stories. It's just the way of delivery has changed, is changing, and everybody in our business, in the media business, needs to get on board with that, or else they'll be like me. They're going to be dinosaurs, but a lot quicker than they think.
Chuck is a huge sports fan, which we'll talk about, and Jeff was able to get Chuck here, even though the Packers connection hopefully sold him a little more with my background there. He's a big Packers fan.
Let me give you a little bit about my background, because actually there's a little sports background. I got started in journalism in 1992, working for this online publication called The Hotline, and this is 1992. There was no web. So we uploaded our information, and the whole point of it is, and looking back on it, we were doing something that now everybody does, aggregates. And we were doing something that said, boy, wouldn't it be great if instead of just having everybody in Washington read the Washington Post and the New York Times, what if we could tell them what people in Des Moines were reading, what people in Manchester, New Hampshire were reading, which of course in our world cared about politics, and what if we could show them that morning, that same day, before they had lunch. And so that was the premise. So, we now joke, a bunch of us alums of this, that we were the internet before the internet, essentially. And we were doing it with, finding, old friends that, hey, can we buy you a fax machine? Can you cut out the newspaper? Can you fax us these clips? And we put this together. And so we were always considered sort of the tech, the only people in Washington that sort of understood what was going on with the changing landscape. And then for me, I always say my big career break came because I wasn't a snob about the internet. In 1996, we partnered with, my company partnered with the Washington Post, ABC News, and Newsweek to start a political website to cover that called Politics Now. And the assumption was, boy, this is going to be great. All the great writers of Newsweek, the great reporters on ABC, and the great reporters on the Washington Post, we're all going to contribute to this. And guess how many of those great reporters wanted to write for the internet in 1996? What do you think, Peter?
4.
Yeah, that was 4 more than, that's 4 more than you should have guessed. It was 0. So here I was at the time, 23, 24, I was getting to write about national politics. Well, it essentially gave me my break. The point, and I always like to tell the story because the point of the story is, I learned early being platform neutral is how you should be thinking about when disseminating information. It doesn't matter where people get the information. Be everywhere. So for me as a career, that was what I think gave me opportunities at a quicker age, at a younger age, simply because the generation ahead of me were a bunch of snobs when it came to the internet. They thought, oh, nobody reads that. Who's reading it? And it's true in 96, whenever we did a chat on politics, it would only be the libertarians that would show up. It seemed like they were the only ones on the internet. Like, no, there were no Republicans, no Democrats, just the libertarians. But it was sort of, I've always taken that lesson. And so one of my goals at Meet the Press has been this concern, right? That you can't just assume people are going to watch television. You have to go to them. You go to them if you have to. You go to them on cable. You go to them with podcasts. You go to wherever they are. And I'm now like going, what is Snap 2? Right? I used to be the guy that told my bosses about the new technology. Now I'm unfortunately on that other side. But what we've tried to do is not be a snob about it. Now, what's interesting is I always felt like for the first 15 years of my career, I worked at a startup like Atmosphere, Hotline, and then actually I had a brief stint helping to start something called the Sports Business Daily, which many of you may know as Sports Business Journal now. But now, working at a big company, it is harder to sometimes to get everybody on board that, hey, we've got to be platform neutral all the time. And it is interesting being now part of a bigger media company trying to make sure we're on top of all of these new technologies. And on one hand, everybody wants to be there, but it is harder sometimes to move the behemoth that is NBC News to say, okay, let's take this great work we did on Sunday and put it on Snap and put it on Twitter and make sure it's on Facebook and make sure it's on OTT. You guys know what OTT is?
No.
Yeah. What do we call it? Am I get it right? Over the top.
Over the top.
Over the top programming, and so it is the essential lesson I've always had in my career is platform neutral is everything. Don't be a snob about any of it.
For me, what has been the most intriguing and curious and in some ways distressing change in the nearly 30 years now that I've been doing television news has been the explosion of opinion. When I started doing news, I started early in the 90s with NBC News. I was originally one of the original anchors for Court TV in 1991 when that began. Came to NBC News, was chief legal correspondent, used to host the Today Show on the weekends. And this might sound fairly quaint to you, but if I ever let my opinion seep into my reporting or even my conversation hosting the Weekend Today Show, I would have been yanked off the air. And nowadays we think about it as that sounds fairly quaint and antiquated. But the reality is, you go back then, there were essentially 3 networks when I was starting, and then you had this fledgling cable news network that people were trying to figure out what that all meant. But with that growth, my friend, former colleague, I know works very closely with Chuck Todd, is Tom Brokaw. And Tom often describes it as the Big Bang Theory, the explosion of news media. And with that explosion has come this sort of explosion of opinion. Now I'm always very quick to say to people, look, journalism has always had embraced opinion as an integral element to it. You go back as far as you can to early newspapers, and there was always a component of opinion. Opinion is essential to drive discourse, to foster introspection, to forge change. But what I have seen, and especially in the last 10 years or so as part of this Big Bang Theory, is the introduction and the driving force of opinion that sadly is absent or unmoored to facts. I use an expression often, and I saw it originally attributed to Winston Churchill. I'm sure somebody else have used it in the past, but Churchill at one point in time said, look, everybody is entitled to your own opinions. What you're not entitled to are your own facts. And he went on to say, facts are very stubborn things. You can push at them, you can pull at them, but in the end, there they are. And so for me, in the last 10 years or so, and again, originally being a legal correspondent, and this had sat through the 9 months of the O.J. Simpson trial, and covered everything from Simpson to the Clinton impeachment trial, the Oklahoma City bombing trial. What I saw with the Simpson trial is that became a bit of a springboard for the creation of the fact-driven legal correspondents or legal analysts. And I think it spread, Chuck, you deal with it every single week in terms of folks very anxious to give you their opinions. I mean, you deal with some folks, I think, who have never had an unexpressed thought on your show.
Some things would stay in the thought bubble.
So for me, that I found it troubling. Again, embracing the notion of opinion, and it's so important to the idea of journalism, but I've seen, Thomas Jefferson said, opinion is power. And what distresses me is that ill-informed, misinformed opinion can be equally powerful. And I see it a lot in terms of the legal reporting. I see it certainly in political reporting. I've been involved with sports for a long time. I'm a former college football player, played at Yale in the early 70s. I've been on the board of the College Football Hall of Fame for almost 20 years now. I worked in conjunction with the NCAA for a decade and a half in various capacities. So, I say to people, I'm an evangelist. I'm an evangelist for the value of college education, for the opportunities offered by college sports, I was raised by a single mother. My father disappeared on us when I was 5 years old. I'm not going to college unless somebody else is paying for it. And I'm comfortable enough at this stage in my life to say I'm probably not getting into Yale unless they wanted me to come play football for them. But it worked out okay. But what troubles me, and bring this back to sports, and I talk about this often around the country, what troubles me is people who have formulated opinions and espousing these opinions with the biggest bullhorn they can find, but they happen to be factually wrong. You know, there are real issues, and Oliver mentioned them before in his conversation. There are real issues that the world of sports are dealing with. But for me, what's so troubling is I see people, these alleged thought leaders, who are offering up these opinions, a drumbeat of opinions, based upon faulty facts that don't exist. So for me, that has been, I think, the great chore for the media business. How do we continue to drive conversation with opinion, which we need to do, but how are we able to determine that those opinions are indeed moored in some way, shape, or form to, I guess the expression politically has become real facts? The fact that we have to append the word real to the beginning of facts raises its own issues. But I think that when you talk about the changes, that to me is what's been most significant.
Yeah, we're going to talk about sort of where's the governor on that. I mean, have we crossed the Rubicon where it's no coming back? And I want to address that after hear from Jane.
I just want to say thanks for having me. It's always a thrill to walk into a law school, considering that I thought I wanted to go to law school until I worked at Cravath, Swaine & Moore as a paralegal for 2 years. And then I decided maybe it wasn't, right. And then I decided maybe not for me, maybe not. But it was a good experience, and I think actually it helped me in my reporting in some ways. I probably got my job at ESPN through Twitter. No one has told me that, but I suspect. And I think it's because I was on in 2008. That's when I joined. I was covering the Jets at the time for a local paper in Westchester County, New York. And I just don't know that there would have been a lot of people reading that copy if I hadn't been tweeting out links to it, if I hadn't been, tweeting the news. And when I started in journalism, it was, let's say, 1997, 98. When I tried out for my first job at a newspaper, I used a Radio Shack Tandy. I don't know if anybody's familiar with that. But what it did was it was almost like a typewriter, but not quite. It showed you 3 lines of text. So you had to write an entire story, 800 words, where you could only see 3 lines of text at a time. And then you had to go back and edit it, seeing 3 lines of text at a time.
No whiteout.
No whiteout. And then you had to use a phone cord and plug it into your Radio Shack Tandy and then dial the number of the fax machine at the office, and that's how they would get the story. So things have really changed. And I think what's changed most for my job is I'm not looking, it used to be, I was writing 600 words and that was pretty much it unless there was something big happening. Now, information can be a long form piece online. You don't have to work at a magazine in order to write something like that. It can be a tweet, obviously, but we even have at ESPN, we've really tried to break up information into all of the different ways that it can be consumed. So we have these on some of the website, we might have just little blurbs of news that are maybe 30 lines long, 40 lines long. They don't even link to a story yet, but just to get it out there. A little bit more than a headline, but a little bit less than a story. And then we'll have short stories, updates, regular conventional looking stories. We will have video that goes with that. Sometimes the video contains all you need to know. It'll just be a standalone video. We'll take it off a TV, or sometimes we'll produce it simply to talk about an issue that's breaking, something to have up there, something for people to interact with and engage with at our site. That is something that's very different. So I can get my job through Twitter because somebody sees what I'm doing and thinks that I'd be a valuable asset somewhere else. I could also easily lose my job through Twitter. So just as easy as it is to put something out there and to find an audience that appreciates it, you have to be pretty careful with it. The idea that you have an editor is out the window when you're dealing with social media. It's you, and you have to be your own editor. And I will sometimes write a tweet, delete the tweet, think about that tweet, maybe write it again, maybe not, maybe say, how could I have thought I would tweet that? So I've seen a lot of people, and we've all seen it, people making really bad decisions on what they're going to put out there. And it's because there is no interference anymore. There is no cushion for anybody. And so I think that actually, to me, means that your credibility lies within your own self. and your own ability to kind of be your own editor and to be somebody who's able to think about issues, not just as I want to get this out there, but then also carry all of these other things. And I think, honestly, it's kind of sharpened us as a profession, where you have to be aware of how your stuff's going to sound. And the people who are just kind of out there flying things off and then, oh, I didn't mean that, or I guess it turned out not to be true, very soon your credibility as a journalist is completely eroded. So in some ways, I think that I have 2 kids, 12 and 14. Learning with them, like teaching them about the internet is interesting because no one ever taught me. And I luckily was at, the age of majority before I had to think about it. But then, teaching a kid about the internet actually has kind of made me think about it all over again. And how do I want her to engage? And how am I telling my 14-year-old the permanence of what she writes, even at this stage in her life? Like, somebody will be able to Google her and maybe pull up a horrible, thing that she said at 15, who knows? So, being able to discuss this, it's been interesting for me because the responsibility, I think, that's placed on younger people, or people maybe at the beginning of a career, it's much greater. And you really have to, in some ways, be more self-possessed than you might have had to be at the beginning of a career, when you're writing a 200-word story that's only going to appear in a local paper, nobody's ever going to see it. So to me, that's kind of when I think about what the future holds and what my career was and how it unfolded, it's going to be very different.
Yeah, and the responsibility, like Peter, your column, your name, but now we talk about your social media. So you're approaching 2 million Twitter followers. How much of responsibility do you feel like, wow, this better be right, this better be something that presents me in the right way, my brand?
Well, there is a responsibility, but I just simply don't feel that. I mean, I feel like, on Twitter, I'm going to be myself, and I'm not going to be the AP style book. I'm going to watch a game and watch Odell Beckham Jr. act like a turd, and I'm going to comment on Odell Beckham Jr.'s acting like a turd right now. So, because everybody can see it.
Is that a journalistic term?
Yes,
Peter?
it is. Turd. TURD, open parentheses, N, end of parentheses. Jerk. Basically, I think that, and look, I do a very good job alienating a lot of people, both on Twitter and through my column, because I say what I think most of the time. Now, as far as having a filter and not just tweeting out everything that comes into your head, yeah, I don't do that. I mean, I do that. I have a filter. But I also think that Twitter is important. Twitter, I remember sitting on a bus at the Super Bowl a couple of years ago, and this guy who I didn't know, he was from a small paper somewhere, and he just said, how do you feel about Twitter? And we were talking about it, and he had a great line. He goes, and this was an older guy, he was maybe 65 years old, and he goes, I like Twitter because it's kind of like my wire service. I am able to follow people who cover all the teams in the NFL and all other sports, and I can find out what's happening just by following all these people on Twitter. It's the greatest thing. And I feel the exact same way. So I think it's a great service. And I think too often Twitter and other social media, we treat it like it's the 7th game of the World Series. You know what? It's okay to be flip. And to, you don't want to write something down. I remember last fall I was on Katie Nolan's podcast, and she said, do you regret the Roger Goodell chili photo? And so, and I said, of course I do. In 2010, I was doing a long profile for Sports Illustrated on Roger Goodell. We were in Cincinnati, and it was lunchtime, and he had finished doing something. And I mentioned to him, man, I lived in Cincinnati for 5 years. I love Skyline Chili. And he goes, what's Skyline Chili? And I said, oh. So we went into a chili parlor. You put a bib on. And so he had some of his minions with him. And they took a picture of us eating chili with bibs on and looking silly. And so I tweeted it out. And so that picture basically has haunted me for the last 7 years, because now I'm wearing a chili bib with Roger Goodell, so I'm in bed with Roger Goodell. And so it's just, of course I regret it because I've been made fun of for years on it. So if I had it to do all over again, I wouldn't do it. But relax. I mean, just relax. It's a fun moment in time. And we're not allowed really most of the time to have fun moments in time on Twitter. And that's the only thing that kind of bugs me about it. It's quite an uncivil atmosphere on Twitter. But again, it's not really going to change the way I am. I am still going to call people out and to give my strong opinions on Twitter because I think that's probably why people follow me, because I'm not afraid to give my opinions.
I've actually changed the way I tweet. I used to be much more unfiltered. And I still, I put an extra filter on because I don't like to become a story. And too often, especially when I got this, it was just a night and day change. When I got this job with Meet the Press, it became different. So there would be a few people, there's a few, there's small media sort of news organizations that just cover the media, and that are just looking to spark fights. They're just looking to exploit something so that Bill O'Reilly will do a segment on me, or Fox and Friends will do a segment on me, or whatever, or some columnist. And there is that point where I want to tweet something like, it's going to be a distraction. It's going to cause heartburn. And, my bosses will be like, and so I'll be honest, I've added a filter on politics.
But don't you think right now
and
you
it bugs
have
me
to?
that I do.
You have to,
and I hate
because
that
of this environment we're in now.
But honestly, I hate that I do. I miss the first 3 or 4 years I did Twitter, when it felt like it was just, I joined in 2008, when it felt as if it was, we're just all having a conversation. Right?
Cocktail party.
It was a cocktail party. We're having a conversation. We're all trying to have a great one-liner. I also use it as a wire service. My favorite time to be on Twitter is at 4:30 in the morning when I get up, when it's only news organizations who have sent out their so for me it's the ultimate wire service at that moment in time. Twitter becomes less readable as the day goes on because it becomes more and more opinion. But I have one other thing that it's done for me in this respect of sort of tweeting something that's become a story. When I've tweeted something and it's become a story, I have an easier time putting myself in the shoes of the people I cover. And maybe some people will not like that. Some people won't. It'll look like, I'm in bed, the idea. But I now have a better understanding of what it's like to be a public official.
But that probably
and I have a little more empathy.
Better. That probably makes you better at it. And
I don't know, but I have a little more empathy, so I'm a little less cynical.
But on the filter, that's on the filter issue, though, going back to something Jack said, it's one thing to express your opinion, you have a platform to do it, but who is responsible, if anyone, other than the individual, to actually worry about whether or not what is said on a news outlet, on a media show, by a media personality on Twitter, actually has some accuracy?
But one of the problems is, look, if I'm reading something that Peter does or Chuck does, they've built up a reservoir of integrity and journalistic trust. So even if I might disagree with one of them, I know where they're coming from, and I can respect their opinions. The difficulty is, the guy, the expression we hear all the time, the guy in his pajamas in his mother's basement on his computer all day long. And in some ways our business has done is we've tried to sort of, unfortunately, we've kind of created a coronation for people who can say something really loud and frequently, regardless of what the content is. I remember when I was covering the O.J. Simpson trial, and I said I saw this as sort of a springboard for all that. And I would see some of the networks, and there would be an array of lawyers hanging out on the courthouse steps. trying to get on television. And I would see some of these guys, who would suspect that of lawyers?
Hey, a couple of them
I
are
was
still
one,
in
by the way.
A couple of them
you know.
became TV stars.
So, and I would see some of these people. And look, my career, I started off as prosecutor. I was a trial lawyer. I tried everything from death penalty cases to antitrust cases. And I'm the first one to say on the air, I have no idea what's going on in this courtroom today. I don't know what this jury is thinking. You know, and I would hear these people get up, and what they realized very quickly is if they said something in 20 to 30 seconds, and they said it really loud, somebody put them on the air. And that sort of went from a cottage industry to being now a significant part of what we do. So we see a lot of these people who realize, and some of them discovered they can make a living out of it, say it really loud, say it frequently, say it in a short enough bite that either for Twitter or for a soundbite for, you know, a minute 30-second story on nightly news, somebody's going to put them up there. But the question, as you said, and the answer is, you know, a lot of us do our own self-editing. A lot of us have people above us who do the editing with us. You know, the first time I did a 60-minute story, because I was mostly a sort of a live television person, and here I'm doing a 60-minute story. We had 20 drafts of the script. We had 3 different screenings, and finally it got on the air. But there was a room full of folks, you know, with eyeballs on this and saying, let's make sure this sounds right, this looks right, this feels right. The difficulty is there are all sorts of entities out there that nobody does that. There are no editors, there are no fact checkers. And you combine that, to me, it's sort of a perfect storm. You combine that absence with the presence of the possibility of notoriety. You know, the idea of people getting known. How many times, and Chuck, you've seen this, and how many times that I've been doing a live stand-up someplace, and remember the idiots that come behind you in the camera, and they kind of do this, and they hold up a number 1, they say, "Hi, Mom," and you're reporting on a death penalty case? You know, or,
is that what that finger is? They're saying number 1? I don't get the number 1 very often. There's one finger held up.
It's, as I said, somebody once referred to it as a digital discourtesy that we're receiving from somebody there. But the reality is there's no caution, there's no speed bump
But isn't
for
that
a lot of people.
Media versus entertainment, right? If those people keep appearing on the air and everybody wants to see it and they're talking loudly, if nobody's policing it, you know, does the media have an obligation to police it, or is it just kind of every person for themselves?
I can say at ESPN, we actually have many people who are concerned with our tweets. and they, you know, we have a social media policy. And it's different, actually, for people who do strict reporting and then for the reporter columnist, which is a hybrid, a new hybrid, which I think just throws a lot of things into confusion sometimes.
Distinction without a difference. I'm sorry, I have this argument internally all the time.
Yeah.
A contributor that has NBC News versus an anchor versus the public just sees NBC News. The public just sees ESPN. I don't care who's talking.
At the same time, though, I wonder if it's been a service for journalists to pretend that we are completely neutral on every subject all the time, because it's a physical impossibility. And so, for example, if the Women's March is happening one day, and I'm a reporter columnist for espnW, which is concerned with women's sports, is it really helpful for me to pretend that I don't care about women's issues, or that I don't see an affinity with that? I don't think it does. And I think it means that when I am reporting on stories where there's an element of gender, I have to be extra careful, because I know that I tend to identify with and as a woman. So for me, it means that seeing where I may have a blind spot is just as important as a reporter, is more important, really, than trying to pretend that I might not have a blind spot. So I always try, in that situation, if I do have an opinion on something, sometimes I'll tweet about it because I don't think it makes sense for me to pretend I don't. But at the same time, when I'm then a reporter in certain situations, I am making sure that there are people who have my back, make sure that I'm getting the sourcing for different stories. And then with social media, we do give a little bit more latitude for people who are columnists. We just do. Because again, you know, ESPN wants voices and wants opinions on the air. People respond to that. People are passionate about sports. And if it's because they're a fan of a team, it used to be when you were a journalist that you wouldn't talk about your team affinity. You wouldn't, other than maybe, cheering for Yale because you went there. If you liked the Packers or whatever, you couldn't say that as a NFL reporter. I mean, and there's no cheering in the press box, and that is for sure. But even today. But at the same time, people will now talk about being a Cowboys fan or whatever at ESPN because they feel like that makes our audience identify with us as reporters. So it's all evolving, but at least at my place, they really are trying to think through what makes fans, what makes our audience want to tune in, and to stoke the things that do, and then to put aside the things that don't.
What's it like for the president to tweet about your eyes?
Well, that goes back to I did do a subtweet that day. I just noted that I was pretty awake, although I did stay up late to watch Mississippi State beat UConn. Hashtag cowbell. Because what was interesting is he's attacked me for a couple years. That nickname, I one time asked him, I said, "Where'd you get that?" And he goes, "I don't remember, but once I come up with a nickname, I can't change. Branding is everything." He has said that to me, and he's, once you pick a name, that's it. But again, it goes back to, still made me, I don't want to become part of the story. Right. I think it is a strategy in politics more and more to make the media part of the story because it's a deflection technique, right? If the media is part of the story, there's less focus on what they did or didn't do, whatever we're talking about. And I think that's something that, God, I don't know how to put this toothpaste back in the tube, but this idea that the media is, of course, that is in the middle of sort of this political discourse rather than being the ones covering it. I mean, I always want to say, I'm covering the story that's in front of me, not the story that I want to have in front of me. People will come back to me and say, "Why is your program so biased?" And I'll sit there and say, "Well, are you watching with an objective eye or a subjective eye? Are you looking for information or affirmation?" And This is something that I constantly sort of, churn with myself, and sort of hand wring, which is this: how do we still stay aggressively reporting without becoming the story? And at the same time, as we get attacked for our credibility, I think one of the mistakes we've made in media over the last 30 years is not defending ourselves enough publicly. And I think it's over time eroded our credibility, because if people are yelling, "You're biased, you're biased, you're biased," and nobody is pushing back saying, no, we're not, and here's why, eventually people are just going to say, all I'm hearing is the one message. And over time, I think it has certainly made it even worse, I think, for our credibility, for our standing with the public. And so I don't know how to get rid of this, other than I do buy into the fact that your credibility now is, you own it. I can't rely on NBC News. I don't rely on MSNBC. They provide the platforms, but at the end of the day, your credibility, you control it. And so I just do my best to fight in my corner of the world and try to at least practice what I'm preaching on this.
One more question about the president. We're talking about Twitter, and it just seems like he is in this age and taking advantage of it, if you will, where he'll send out a tweet, then the outrage will flow, and by the time the outrage is still brewing, he's on to the next. And that's what we're talking about here.
No, he is in some ways is more in tune sort of with the short attention span culture that we have conditioned the public to be, frankly, for the last 25 years. And he is the moment, his attention span happens to be pretty short. I mean, he himself brags about he doesn't begin. It was one of these fascinating sort of, and he's very. I always say this about Trump. He's self-aware about who he is in many ways. He likes to begin his day. He says, "I don't like to have a plan for the day. I like to react." Twitter is the ultimate reaction machine, which is why, in many ways, he's so effective at using it as a tool. And so I think we still have to adjust on how to cover it. You know, I still want to ground myself in the belief that the president's words matter, whether they're uttered or written or tweeted. That the president's words always matter, and they should matter the same. They should matter with the same weight, because you know, as we were just discussing earlier, the mediums change all the time. But at the same time, he's very manipulative with the Twitter, right? He knows that, yeah, I can distract Morning Joe for 2 hours with one tweet at 6:15 in the morning. And he's right. And at the same time, do we ignore it? Is it our responsibility to pick and choose when to ignore the president? To me, that's actually our responsibility is to cover the president. And the president's tweeting this, okay, the president's tweeting this, but this is a challenge. And he is, in some ways, more effective at it right now than we are covering it.
And Peter and Jane, when you hear, stick to sports. When we talk about things like this, bigger things than sports, what's your reaction?
Well, in 1997, the internet was born in my life. There was this, we merged at that time, Sports Illustrated with CNN, and we had a sports website that was called cnnsi.com. So all the editors went around to the people on their beats and asked them, would you write a column for this new site? And I would say, just like what Chuck said before about his birth of the internet, that nobody wanted to do it. And I don't know how many people at Sports Illustrated at the time did it, but it might have been one or two, and I was one. And so I wrote a column. My editor said to me, I said, what do you want? I don't really know what this is. What do you want? And he goes, I just want you to empty out your notebook. If you had dinner with Warren Sapp on Saturday night before the Bucks game on Sunday, and you didn't use much in your story, write about your dinner with Warren Sapp, or write about what you did during the week. And he said, the internet's going to be a very personal place. So write about your opinions on things that you can't get in the magazine. If you're a coach in your little town in New Jersey, go write about that. And so I ended up just writing a column that was, I remember 2 weeks in a row, maybe in 2002, my daughter, who was a softball pitcher, got on a great run in the state tournament in New Jersey. And so I led my column in the spring a couple of weeks on her softball games. And people just howled. They were mad, they were bitter, they were unhappy that I was introducing another kind of column into this sports world. But look, on May 17th, there's not necessarily a lot going on in the NFL. And so anyway, but I think what happened with the internet over time is that it was basically made for your opinions and your life to some degree. And that isn't the case with all columns on the internet, but that sort of became the case with mine. And that's sort of how it grew over time. I'm not saying it's right. I'm not saying it's wrong. But when you read Monday Morning Quarterback, you're usually going to get some opinions out of me about things that are not football. And that's just the way it's grown in the last 20 years.
When I got on Twitter in 2008, not only was I the Jets beat writer for the Journal News, I was also in charge of social media for my roller derby league, Suburbia Roller Derby, where I played for 7 years. So for me, I was not only tweeting about what I was writing, I was also tweeting like, hey, come to a bout. We're having a bout in Yonkers on Friday. It's going to be great.
They're called bouts?
They're called bouts.
I didn't realize that. Roller derby matches are bouts.
If you would like
even
to
more
attend,
reason to go watch roller derby.
It's well titled.
We will be tweeting about bouts.
What was your nickname?
Well, because I play, I'm a sports writer, so my derby name is Leslie Eviscerate. And I got permission from Leslie before I did that to her name. So she was on board. But my point is that it is a personal thing, right? Like, so I'm letting people know already a little bit more about me than might show up in the column I'm writing on a newspaper, or the high school sports story when I first got into the business, and that is part of it. So people do know you a little bit more. I don't tweet pictures of my kids. To me, that's like, I don't want anybody to know what my kids look like if possible. My Facebook is a private account. But in terms of like Twitter, it's almost it's a conversation. So there's more of you that has to participate in it if you're going to engage readers as people. Now, that was more like that in 2008 than it is today. But at the same time, that is then part of your personality. And so I feel like if something happens and I have a strong response to it, I'm not going to call someone a name on Twitter or fly off the handle. But if somebody tweets something at me that's unfair, I may go back at them, which is something that you don't normally do as a newspaper reporter. It's not something if you got a letter to the editor, you wouldn't go back and say that's an unfair letter. But at the same time, I think this medium does mean that we're more us because we're actually having the conversation. And so in that sense, if you leave a lot, if you are just a daily news service for whatever sport you're covering or whatever event you're covering, then you are very two-dimensional. You might as well be a bot.
See, I think, I'm just going to follow up on that and just say that I do think the one thing that has changed as far as objective news reporting in sports is that I think it has become acceptable, and not only acceptable, but encouraged to not necessarily give a strong opinion, but to take the years of experience you have in what you do and look at something that isn't just only the facts. And I'll give you a very good example. So I'm at the league meetings a couple of weeks ago in Phoenix, and on Monday, the owners vote 31-1 to allow the Oakland Raiders to move to Las Vegas. And so this was the third time in 16 months that a franchise had moved, St. Louis to L.A., San Diego to LA, and Oakland to Las Vegas. And it was the third time that they moved. St. Louis, not so much, and this is not a diss on St. Louis, but you'll get what I'm saying. San Diego was an absolute hotbed. They love the Chargers, great fans who go to Charger games. Oakland is one of the most unique stadium experiences in all of sports. And you go to games there and you just say, wow. I mean, I wish I cared about anything in life as much as these guys care about the Oakland Raiders. And so I just said to myself, okay, so there's going to be a brand new, probably when it's over $3 billion, 294-acre sports palace in Los Angeles that's going to house two of these teams. The campus of the new Rams Stadium is bigger by 3 acres than the campus of the University of Oregon in Eugene. But so you have that, and then you have the Raiders moving, getting $750 million in public money to move to Las Vegas. And so the lead on my story when this happened, and I don't remember word for word, but basically was the NFL on Monday continued to choose stadiums over fans in the decision of the Raiders to go. And so that could be seen as sort of a slap at the owners or whatever, but it's factual. The NFL is basically saying about fans, hey, we like you and we're going to give lip service to you, and we really want you to buy our jerseys, but you know what? You're not as important as this piece of concrete and this building over here.
But that's the definition of analysis. That to me is the difference between analysis and just sort of the hot take, right? Hashtag hot take. That is experiential analysis.
And you look at, and you're right, because that's an analysis by somebody who's lived this, and you can
who is
point
credible,
to facts,
and you're the expert. Like
you cover it. One of the
to me, it doesn't come across as an opinion.
Yeah,
Right.
The difficulty I've seen, for instance, let's bring this back to the world of sports, and again, college sports. And I said I'm an apostle. But I've actually called in to some radio shows. Now, they're shows that I'm usually a guest on anyway, so I'm not that guy saying, "Hey, long-time listener, first-time caller." We got Jack from New Jersey here on the thing. So
Joe from
I'll
Glassboro.
call in.
Rex going to get fired.
I know. So I'll call in and say, "Hey, it's Jack Ford. I've been on with the guys before, and they just said something. Can I come on?" And I hear things, and again, it's not analysis. I heard right before the college football championship game, Clemson, Alabama. And I heard people saying, they're not real students. These are football factories. We shouldn't call them college athletes. Now, look, we all know that there are stories out there where that can be true. It didn't happen to be true with them. On the football field that day, and I called in and said, guys, do you know, there are 27 graduate students on the field between Clemson and Alabama. There are 3 guys who already have master's degrees and working on a second master's degree. Clemson is number 2 after Stanford in terms of a graduation rate. Clemson graduates their football players, it was something in the area of almost 90%, way ahead of the other male students at Clemson, and Alabama was number 7. Now, you might not like the notion of how they do business. I did a story for 60 Minutes on Dabo Swinney and Clemson, and I was astonished at the investment in education there. You walk into the football building in Clemson, you know what the first sign you see is? In the last 6 years, 124 of 131 guys have graduated. Guys that didn't graduate are in the NFL. That's a really good story, I think. That's a really,
no idea.
And yet you have people on the air talking as if this is really true, and you have people out there listening, and we know psychologically the more often you hear something, the more apt you are to accept it. And that, I think, is very different from Peter doing a story, which I happen to agree with, about, we're taking stadiums over.
But this is the problem, is that the conflation of just sort of the barstool guy, all right, who's spouting off an opinion. And by the way, when I do sports, yeah, I think I'm a pretty educated fan, but I fully acknowledge, I tweet more about sports sometimes than politics, because for the personality thing, it's the one time I feel like I can express my opinion. Right? I don't feel I can express my opinion on politics. It's very dangerous in many ways.
Maybe that's why I tweet about politics then.
Right? That's what I mean. It's
I don't
like,
cover.
Hey, stick to sports, right? I get the whole stick to politics. But this conflation of sort of opinion. Okay, so we take Peter's example here. That, yes, that's opinion. On one hand, but that's an opinion based on a whole series of facts versus. There is now, and the problem is too many mainstream news organizations, all of whom are represented on this stage, allow people to go on and spout opinion based on stereotypes. Because what you just described, Jack, is that stereotype opinion. And I used to get really defensive, for instance, in the University of Miami. Oh, Jimmy Johnson back in the day and all this, he had an 87% graduation rate. The thugs of the University of Miami. And that used to yes, I was a fan, but it grated on me even more because I knew those people. And it's just like, hey, go to the University of Miami. It's not the easiest school in the world, number one. And by the way, go look at the fact. But it didn't matter. They wanted to do the story about the fatigues. Hey, it's the guys in the fatigues, and they celebrate. So if they celebrate, they must be idiots. Right? And that's the problem. That used to just be over here, but now we all put them on TV and print next to Peter.
Right.
And that's what we've
done.
And
and again, the stereotypes of the dumb jocks, right? And I was one, and we sort of lived through it. But again, if you ask people out here, what do you think the graduation rate is for Division I athletes in the 6-year window that the federal government uses to gauge it? It's 86%. You know what the graduation rate is for other students, non-athletes? 65%. That's a pretty impressive number. And look, were there times in the past, and are there some institutions where they don't have impressive numbers? Sure. But that, again, it's a compelling story as to the progress that's been made. African-American Division I basketball players, it was abysmal 10 or 15 years ago. Now I think the most recent number is something close to 77% graduation rate. So again, these are opinions not based on analysis, not based at all on an interpretation of facts, but a drumbeat because people will listen. Because people are much more willing to buy into what's in local news, the adage, if it leads, it bleeds, right? Watch your local news tonight, and what you're going to see is the lead story is going to be, say there's going to be a murder, it's going to be a fire, it's going to be something. Maybe there'll be what they call a kicker at the very end, which is kind of a nice, heartwarming story. And one of the difficulties, I think, in covering, and I'll talk about college sports here, there are stories such as the Baylor case. That was really good reporting and consequential reporting. But yet there are a lot of great stories out there that nobody ever talks about just because, it doesn't bleed, so it's not going to lead.
Well, I think Peter can back me up on this, but one of the best things about covering an NFL team or an NFL locker room is how quickly those stereotypes are defeated. When you meet all of the different players and you get to know them, it's completely different than that idea of, thugs. Really, and I think part of it is because in the NFL, they do have to go to school. It's not one and done. You really do have to stay, and it makes a difference. And even when you come across stories like the North Carolina paper classes and things like that, I mean, I see that education reflected in the players that we cover all the time.
Yeah, and one reason I got into media, because I'm like, no, they're wrong. I'll show them. This is how it really happens. Last thought from each, and what Jack brought up earlier, sort of, can we put the genie back in the bottle? Because now it's opinion-based, it's embraced debate, it's popular, it's getting the clicks, yes, there's credibility among people and among the best people, but are we ever going to get in sort of real governance of opinion, real governance of fact-based rather than throw it out there?
And let me just add to Chuck's point, you may not be able to control the Barstool guy, but does the mainstream media have a responsibility to try to help put that genie back in the bottle? And if so, how are they going to do it?
Right.
Real quick, I'll jump in. I don't think it's going to change. I think it's not going to go back, let's say that. There can be change in the future. Who knows what it's going to be? I mean, 20 years ago, who would have envisioned that Twitter is essentially a wire service for us, that we get a lot of stories from that. So it's not going to go back to what it was. I think you'll probably see it'll become exaggerated in some fashion. I think the answer is, from our perspective, you need to make sure, sometimes you hear people talk about counter-programming. You just need to make sure that people are out there telling the stories. And if somebody wants to believe that all college athletes are thugs and rogues and idiots and morons, well, we need to make sure that somebody else is out there telling the stories that make it clear that that's just not true. Are there instances of people like that? Of course there are. And do the bad stories need to be told? Of course they do. But I think the answer is you're not putting anything back into a bottle. I think you just have to work a little bit harder about making sure that, again, using the term I hate to use, the real facts are out there for consumption.
Look, I can tell you the lesson that I say that we in the political news media should have taken away from 2016, and so far we haven't collectively. In fact, a colleague of mine reminded me of this the other day when he goes, there are 500 journalists covering, it was during the healthcare thing, there were like 500 reporters on Capitol Hill covering that story, and probably 4 that were out in Rolla, Missouri, in some other town around in America wondering how is the new healthcare bill going to impact them. So, I think one of look, I am optimistic, not that we're ever going to put the genie back in the bottle, but if you look at the history of new mediums, they do start out sort of sometimes it can just be sort of, some can be conspiratorial, but some can be, less based in facts. I mean, the newspapers in the 19th century were, barely factual, at the time, and in radio in its early days. And so there is something to that. I do think that over time, now crowdsourcing essentially does sift out the true bad apples. But one of the concerns that I think technology has done is created it is disincentivized reporters to leave their areas, their physical space, because you don't need to. And obviously, in the cost-cutting nature of big media, any way you're going to, no, you know what, I need to cut your travel budget, so no, you can't do, I wanted to do a whole, a whole little tour, take my show on the road in a couple of spots, and no, the money's not there, that sort of thing. And it's because it's too easy, right? And it's too easy to, if you can't spend the money and tell your bosses that, yes, that's going to make you more money by spending this money in journalism, and you'll see the immediate impact, they're not always going to say yes. So I do think one of the things we have to guard against is this idea of no longer doing our own experiential journalism. Get out there, get out of Washington if it's politics, get out of, New York, LA, or Washington if it's anything sometimes. And I think that in time does help. I mean, The reason we lost credibility with rural America is we didn't go and tell their stories. We were more likely to tell you the story of the dreamer in Los Angeles whose parents might get deported than we were to tell you about the opioid addict in Youngstown, Ohio. And part of that was, that's where you can end up with groupthink. And then over time, that's how you erode your credibility if you're not out there just telling the stories of all Americans. Because if you're not, then the Barstool guy is suddenly more credible than we are. And that, because at least the Barstool guy is talking about people that live in his community.
I think one of the most important things that we can do right now as the news media is we can have a part of, like at the MMQB, we're going to have some opinionated columns in there, which is fine and which adds to the discussion. But we are going to have some stories that are going to sift through the guy who's sitting at the bar and Talk Show America and Tweet America, and they are going to be real, they're going to be true, and people can say whatever they want about them, but I will stake my absolute total professional reputation. I'll give you an example. We're in the middle right now of doing a Tim Tebow story, okay? And it's everything Tebow. It's Tebow the baseball player, it's Tebow the icon, it's Tebow, the sort of cultural magnet for so many people in our society. And one of the reasons I wanted to do this is because I believe that so many people, for instance, with Tebow, and it could be that this is true. Oh, it's all a publicity stunt by the Mets for signing Tebow. Oh, Tebow will never be able to play baseball. Oh, this. And all those things may be true. But I just told our reporter, you got some time to do this. And I just want you to shine. I just want you to hold up a mirror to this process, to Tim Tebow's life right now. And whatever you find, you find. And whatever it is that you write, I trust you. I'll back you 1,000%. And I don't care if it seems like some silly cliche or say, I just want you to write what is. And that, in my opinion, has to be our goal in this business right now. Chuck Todd will tell you this, Jack, Jane will tell you this. Our whole jobs, and I would feel awful. I'd feel awful if I ever got out of this business someday and the prevailing opinion on me was, oh, he always had his favorites and he always did it this way and he did that. There are going to be some people who are going to feel that way, but I want basically my reputation whenever I leave this business to say that he sought the truth. And that, I think, regardless of how it's done, whether you periscope the truth, tweet the truth, write the truth, video the truth, it has to be the truth.
I definitely agree with that. And I think back to when I first started in this business and I knew I wanted to be a sports writer, and I was a huge Knicks fan. Of course, all fandom has left the building for me, except for the 93 Knicks, which I still adore, but luckily that's not really a team that anyone can cheer for anymore. But I sat down with somebody who covered the Knicks, and it was like peeling back the curtain on that team. This reporter was fair. This reporter, covered the team exactly as a reporter should. And yet, I got to kind of hear what he thought of the players. I got to learn a little bit more about Oakley and, who's a jerk and all this. And I was like, wow, this is so cool. And I feel like journalism has, because of social media, evolved to the point where we have those reporters who used to do the straight reporting for the newspaper, but now we get to know them a little bit better because we see them. We're not sitting down and having dinner with them, but we kind of get a little bit more of a window onto their personal thoughts about covering this group of people, or what the personalities are like, or really kind of seeing another layer. In some ways, I think it adds a layer of depth to what we're able to understand about some of the people who are newsmakers, because we have a little bit more informality with the way that we're able to present some of the reporting that we've done. At the same time, I agree. I think fairness is the most, whether you have opinions whether you don't, fairness is always important. And if you're going to offer an opinion, for example, or if I'm going to tweet about domestic violence that isn't sports related, because I've covered the subject so much in sports, I'm tweeting about it based on my experience and the reporting that I've done. So I feel like it's important to kind of have that more. Cheap shots are not professional. So we have to figure out how we're going to walk that line between having a voice that is more than just what appears under our byline and still being professional about the way that it's delivered. But I think ultimately it benefits our readers to have more insight into the people and the situations that we cover.
We could go all day, but we can't. We've got a next panel. The guy's got to make trains. Let's thank this panel. Great to hear.